Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Unauthorized Disclosure Weekly Podcast. I'm Kevin Gastola, joined by the show's co-host, Rania Kalik. Hey, Rania.
Hey, Kevin.
And we're very pleased to have as our guest this week, Joe Lauria, who is the editor-in-chief of Consortium News. And he's joining us to talk about some developments in the world of his website, the censorship environment, and again, the climate that we see with the war in Ukraine. So thanks for joining, Joe.
Thank you, Kevin. Rania. Good to be here with you.
And the best way to set this up is to say that your organization has been censored. But I think before we get in, and I have I have the screenshot that you put up for your website showing the message that was sent to you. You were censored by PayPal. But before we get too far ahead, let's make sure that the people who listen or watch this know what Consortium News is. So give people some of the history, where it comes from, and just let's be absolutely certain that people know what Consortium News does before we talk about the censorship.
Right. That's good. It is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, online news site in the United States. I'm talking about going online 5 days before Salon.com did. That's November 15, 1995 is when Bob Perry went online with Consortium News. It was weeks or months ahead of the LATimes.com and the NewYorkTimes.com and the WSJ. So it's pretty old in terms of the internet, actually, maybe ancient history. It's been there ever since. It lives off the donations of its readers and recently of our viewers with our webcast CN Live. It was founded in 1995 by Robert Parry. It was something of a household name during the Iran-Contra scandal. He was an investigative, reporter for the Associated Press. And when I say investigative reporter, it's a term used lightly these days, but he actually spent months on articles, and AP let him do that. I mean, that is what an investigative unit does. They pay you to work on one story for 2 or 3 months or more, maybe 2 or 3 different stories, but you work in the long haul. And the most important stories that he published for AP were about Iran-Contra. Most Americans of any age may have heard of Oliver North. He was the American colonel who worked secretly out of the basement of the White House to sell arms to the Contras in Nicaragua by selling arms to Iran, which was calling America the Great Satan back then. That was right after 5 years or so after the Islamic Revolution in Iran. And the Congress of the United States, which of course has the power over expenditures, had voted to cut off funding to the Contras in Nicaragua. That was after the Sandinistas had come to power. The United States funded and armed this counter-revolutionary group, which called themselves the Contra. They committed huge amounts of massacres. They were death squads. That name actually may have originated with them, and including killing some American nuns who were down there. And that was kind of the last straw for members of Congress. So they cut off the funding. That should have been the end of it. But the Reagan administration, he claims behind his back, set up this scheme where they would sell weapons to Iran through in a middleman in Israel and other countries, actually, and use those proceeds secretly obtained to illegally fund the Contras. Bob Perry uncovered most of that story, not all of it, but he particularly uncovered the role of Oliver North. But the interesting thing is AP didn't want to run the story. They made him rewrite it, and his partner, Brian Barger, several times. Finally, one editor said, can't you just get Oliver North to confess? Even though they had dozens of documents, many people on and off the record confirming the story. The Spanish wire of AP inadvertently put it out, and that was the end of it. They had to publish it in English. So one of the big stories of Iran-Contra may never have been published if the AP editors had blocked it as they intended. He had several other run-ins like that with editors at AP suppressing stories critical of U.S. foreign policy and the U.S. government, and he then went to PBS Frontline, did a couple of documentaries about the October surprise, and he then had the same kind of experience. That was actually Newsweek before PBS. Newsweek also trying to suppress his stories. So he decided in 1995 to start this thing on the internet, which he had never heard of before, called Consortium News. That's the real background of it. Bob died in January 2018. I took over as editor on April 1st, 2018. I've been running it for 4 years. I have a corporate media background like Bob did, but like Bob, I had my stories suppressed. And I'm talking particularly at the Wall Street Journal, where I worked for 6 years, and I was 6 years at the Boston Globe, the Sunday Times of London. So I've a lot of Murdoch papers I've worked for, and I know the inside game, and I know what happens. Editors suppress stories, and Bob started this website because of that. And I started writing for him while I was still at the Wall Street Journal, and I used my real name. And when he died, I was given the job to run the site. We've carried on, and my belief in with the same principles Bob had, same kinds of stories. He was right on the Ukraine story from the start. One of the first to print about the coup, the U.S.-backed coup in Kiev in 2014. He was all over the civil war against Donbass. He was writing about the neo-Nazis in Ukraine early on. And Bob was also one of the first to break Russiagate story. Aaron Matei's given him a lot of credit for that. So it's a website that fills in what the corporate media purposely omits and takes different angles than they do on stories. But that when they leave out certain crucial facts, that changes the entire complexion of the story. Ukraine being a perfect example of that. You will not read in corporate media about the Nazis, or they're downplayed, or the 2014 coup is just denied or not explained. The civil war in Donbass never happened. And then you get the impression that Putin woke up one morning and decided, well, who am I going to invade today? And okay, how about Ukraine? And it's all of the causes of the war are not being permitted to be discussed. And this is an important point. We don't report too much about what's happening on the ground in Ukraine, because frankly, I don't know what the hell's happening on the ground. You have widely different stories going on, and Russia was stalled outside of Kiev, or Russia says that that was a diversionary tactic to keep Ukraine's forces pinned down in the capital so they couldn't go to Mariupol, where the battle was. So you have, when both sides agree on something, is when I believe it. For example, Ukrainians said they sunk that Russian ship in the Black Sea. Okay, and then the Russians said it was sunk. I knew it was sunk, but then, of course, the Ukrainians said, well, we use missiles, and the Russians say it was an accident. So now I don't know what happened. What we are doing, though, is filling in the historical and contextual background to this story, and that's, forbidden right now. That is not in the media. And again, as I said, the coup in 2014, we can go back to 1949 when the U.S. First worked with former Ukrainian fascists to try to run sabotage operations inside Ukraine against the Soviet Union. That cooperation led all the way into the 60s, even as early as late as 1991 with this Mykola Lebed. And certainly the U.S. was involved deeply. We know from the tape of Victoria Nuland and Jeffrey Piot, the ambassador, they were involved in the. So we're trying to provide that context, the causes of the war. This is not an excuse for anything that's happening. Nobody says that saying Versailles Treaty was one of the causes for the rise of Nazism and World War II. But you're allowed to say that as historians. But today we can't talk about these background issues to Ukraine.
Yeah, it's a really good point, and that leads us into one of the, I think, most dangerous things taking place right now as far as free speech is concerned, and that is the suppression and censorship that I think we've been dealing with for a number of years, particularly in our alternative media. But it sort of took a new, very alarming turn with an attack on the ability of alternative media to essentially raise money, because alternative media, unlike these corporate media outlets, typically has to raise money from its readers and viewers in order to be able to function. And your outlet, as well as another outlet, which was Mint Press News, was recently had its PayPal essentially deactivated, and your funds that you've already raised that you hadn't already taken out of PayPal seized. Can you tell us what happened here? Because this is like almost like sanctioning. There's like sanctions being placed on media outlets is what we're seeing take place.
But there aren't sanctions. That's a good point. I mean, whatever we think of the U.S. government seizing $300 billion of Russia's foreign currency inside the U.S., or taking oligarchs' yachts, there is a law. The Treasury Department has, by law, Congress has passed a law that says they can do these things. These are sanctions. There's no such thing on alternative media like Mint Press or like us.
Right.
obviously. So what authority they're acting on is one of the big questions here. What happened is we received an email, which we didn't see for a couple of days because it was sent to one of the old email accounts that an AOL account that Bob Perry set up that we check only once a week. So it probably happened around the same day or the day after Mint Press. We just didn't see it until Saturday late. And it said, as you just showed in that screenshot, that they you could not use PayPal anymore with some kind of security risk. And they don't go into any details. First of all, there was no notification, no warning, no real reasons why this happened, other than these vague terms that we were a security risk to whom they don't even say, and that therefore they had to shut it down. And no due process involved in this whatsoever. This is typical of how they act. It's apparently the same thing they did with Min Press News. So I had to go digging a bit to find out what possibly could they mean. You know, that it's inconsistent with the user agreement they write in the email that we got. Okay, so I looked into the user agreement, and it's quite long, but at the bottom there are some restricted activities. And the only one I could think of that might have some relevance to why they kicked us off PayPal, so that no one could donate to us anymore using PayPal as they had done for years. And most importantly, maybe they have seized over $9,000 of the funds that we had in PayPal, and they're going to do a 180-day review, and they might give it back to us, or they might not, depending on whether they feel that they were somehow hurt by whatever we did, and they would pay themselves damages. Not a court, not a jury deciding what damages are. They themselves will take the funds that we have left in their trust and putting it in their hands and actually take it from us. So I dug into the user agreement, and the one thing that I could see is that trying to find it here. I don't see any existing. Sorry. Okay, it says that the money violations under the restricted activities of the user agreement include providing, quote, false, inaccurate, or misleading information to PayPal, other PayPal customers, or third parties. So I think that is most likely the reason why they shut us down, because they claim without any due process, without any hearing, without any other thing other than their own judgment, that we published false, inaccurate, or misleading information to a third party, i.e. the public, our readers, and our donors. And that could only apply to what's going on in Ukraine. As I said in my lengthy introductory answer, we are reporting stuff that is being shut down in the corporate media. It looks like they clearly want total control of the narrative. The word total is in totalitarian. We are not a very influential website when you look at the entire media landscape of the United States. We normally got 10,000 viewers a day. That the readers, we've gone up to about 40 on some days now because of the war. And they don't want to leave even a little spark of dissent. They want to shut it down. So it seems like this is the reason, although we still don't know for sure.
So just quickly to get in here, there's another website that's called Geopolitics and Empire. Hervoji Moritz, I think he's Turkish. They also were banned from using PayPal, and obviously this is, as you can glean from the name of their small publication or what they do, that it would be covering foreign policy from a completely opposite narrative and similar to the way we like to view and color in different things. So it is such that we're seeing these different organizations targeted. Now, just to clarify quickly, Joe, you said they may seize, in the headline for the Consortium News, you said they may seize your money. Right now, though, is it true? Is it fair to say that they have already seized the money and then they are going to decide whether to give it back, or is it going through a review process? So you really haven't lost it yet.
Well, I was able to reach. I think they've lost it. I don't mean the money. I spoke, believe it or not, to a customer service person at PayPal. That took 2 days for me to get through. But I did speak to her. She was extremely helpful. I think even sympathetic maybe to what was going on. And she said to me when I asked her about that, I said, what about the money? Is it possible that they won't return it? Because it says, if applicable, they will return it. What does that mean? And she said, I'm quoting from her, if there is a violation, it is possible the money could be kept as damages to PayPal. So they are going to review this for 180 days and then decide whether to give it to us. So they have it. We don't have access to it. It's frozen. Just the way they froze the Russian $300 billion or the yachts from an oligarch. They've got it. Now, could we get it back? Hopefully, because here's the deal. I asked her, were there any complaints made to us? Did any government agency or private agency or any individual or customer complain? And she looked and said there was no case history. So who was behind this? Now, it's all speculation at this point, but you have to think that maybe there was someone in a government agency, maybe someone in former intelligence offices, maybe this new Mary Poppins woman who is now in charge of the Ministry of Truth. So somebody's behind this. We don't know, but we do know is that Facebook and Twitter and Google were browbeaten in public in Congress, starting from, Ron, to start a few years ago, particularly with Russiagate, that they browbeat them to be tougher on stamping out what they call disinformation or misinformation. So that was government directly leaning on private companies to do the job that government cannot directly do. Given the First Amendment in the U.S. Constitution, which last time I looked was still there, still written there. So PayPal, there is a Supreme Court decision. I don't have it in front of me now, but several people have referred to it. Glenn Greenwald did an excellent piece about it. That ruled that a government cannot use a private company as a proxy to do what they otherwise cannot do legally. And this is clearly a case of that. But with Mary Poppins, we've got the government directly doing it now. That's a whole new thing. Now, I don't say that because she just came online with her karaoke, that was related to what happened to us. This may be a process that was going on. There was already a review of our history. There was something in our history that showed risk. So I think it probably if it came from government influence from the former, where somebody in government leaned on PayPal to get us out, mint press. What a coincidence about Ukraine going on. This is what it's about. It's got to be.
So actually, since we're on the topic, I do want to ask you some more stuff specifically related to suppression in your outlet. But you mentioned this Mary Poppins woman. Of course, you're talking about, what's her name? Nina Jankowicz? Is that her name? The woman who was just appointed as essentially like the Ministry of Truth director, but they're not calling it that. They're calling it like a government advisory board what do they, Kevin, do you have the details? I had it in front of me and now I can't find it. I'm like, looking.
Yeah, I was going to find it. I'll find an image so we can show people while Joe's talking about it. It's the Disinformation Governance Board, and it's out of the Homeland Security, which, let's just be clear, my view, I don't know if Joe will agree based on his assessment of government, but there's absolutely no use or value for the Homeland Security Department. It doesn't do anything that any other agencies don't do. And it's been proven to be completely wasteful. And I mean, it frequently gets in trouble for going after activist groups in the United States. And then there are congressional hearings about it. And they're basically, seems like they're doing things that the FBI can't get away with doing.
Well, that's right. We already have the FBI, and we not only get rid of them, we should get rid of NATO with them. Both of them can go 2 for 1.
Yeah,
so,
right. Yeah, but she also, this woman, Nina Jankowicz, has previously worked for the National Democratic Institute, which is an arm of the National Endowment for Democracy, which is basically like a CIA cutout that was created by Reagan, as we all know, to essentially do what the CIA used to do covertly, but quite overtly. In terms of like training civil society groups to like cause destabilization in adversary countries. But she also, interestingly enough, worked for the post-coup government in Ukraine, which I thought was really interesting. She was like an advisor to them when she was working as a disinformation. She also worked as a disinformation fellow. Like, I don't even know what that means. A disinformation fellow at the Wilson Center, which is a pretty hawkish U.S. government funded think tank, much like all the other think tanks. And she also has a history of referring to independent media outlets as Russian disinformation. So that's the woman who's now going to be in charge of this weird new board at the Department of Homeland Security. And it's amazing to me how the Department of Homeland Security has gone from being obsessed with, I don't know, protecting us from so-called terrorist attacks to now we're protecting us from Russian disinformation. It's just kind of incredible how they can so quickly adjust and so fluidly move from like one big, scary menace to the next. But anyways, this is so alarming because this comes after years of a certain kind of suppression I think all of us in independent media have been dealing with in terms of the way the algorithm is changed, whether it's for Google or for Twitter or for Facebook, in order to suppress content that isn't CNN, basically, and that is questioning mainstream narratives. So I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about that. What, in the past, let's say decade, or maybe even the last 5 years, can you tell us a little bit about the various ways that your outlet has experienced this sort of softer suppression, the kind that, we know is happening, but we can only point to like statistics to show like our readership has gone down this much, our viewership has gone down this much?
Well, I mean, starting from the Iraq War or even from 9/11, and the DHS is kind of a psychological operation, using the word homeland. I just wanted to add that, which of course the Nazis used, Heimat. That was never in American lexicon before in terms of government agency. We didn't need it, as Kevin said, and it's an overlay to show how frightened we should all be. I mean, the United States has no real enemies that could harm them. They're so protected by two oceans and the two neighboring countries. So you've got to drum up fear, and NHS helps to do that. Now, Consortium News started I can't talk before 2000, but I'm sure Bob could probably give examples of what he went through if he were with us. But certainly he was smeared as a Saddam apologist because he questioned the intelligence going into the invasion of Iraq, which of course we all know now was the right thing to do because it was rubbish. There were no WMD. Saddam was not working with terrorists, and he was a threat to his neighbor, sure. But the U.S. had built him up anyway to fight Iran. And in 1990, they trapped him in there to invade Kuwait. I think the evidence is overwhelming for that, in order to destroy his military. Well, back in 2003 again, they decided to go after him. And when a site like Consortium News questioned that intelligence, then the insults came. Those insults picked up really strongly during Russiagate, Putin puppet, Kremlin stooge, etc. That's just a tactic, obviously, to not discuss the facts. They don't want to argue. If that's the first resort they have is to call you names, they've got no argument. And that's the kind of things we were going through. And then there was the story that Google was de-ranking websites. And that also happened when Bob was still alive and the editor. And I think he found some evidence that maybe our stories weren't coming up as high on Google, but very subtle stuff. We've never been, knock on wood, never been suspended a day by Twitter, or we did have one video taken down by YouTube for a ridiculous reason. We had Greg Palast on, and he was talking about his, at that time, new video about the Georgia recount election. And at the very beginning of this 1 hour video that we did with him, we showed a clip from the film. And there was like a 1 minute long section of Trump supporters saying that the election was stolen. But the rest of the show, we did not support that. We criticized that. It wasn't about that. It was about the Georgia election. And it seems, based on that, an algorithm showed that we were somehow supporting the Trump contention that the election had been stolen. And you know what? You could say that if you want. I don't believe that. Conservative News doesn't believe that. But you should be able to say whatever you want politically. But that was enough to get the thing taken down. And of course, when you argue with them in your appeal, okay, I can understand an algorithm making a mistake, but they didn't want to listen. That video is gone from YouTube forever. That's nothing. That's small potatoes now compared to what's happening to Lee Camp, to Chris Hedges, to Abby Martin, of course, with all of their stuff on YouTube having been taken down now. But we're building up. These are the kinds of things. Until now, I would say, to answer your question, Rania, is that we've been unscathed by all of this for the most part. But it's a different world now after February 24th, 2022. The invasion day.
It really is.
And I'm gonna pull up the statement that Manar Muhaweshs put out just so that we can have their words, because obviously we should have solidarity with all these organizations. I think collectively it's going to require all of us to fight this and make sure that we are able to survive. So she put together this statement. It was her and senior staff writer Alan McLeod who were essentially told that they were banned from getting anything from PayPal. And this is what they shared on social media. That was outrageous to be told that tech giants, which are run by those who directly profit from the new Cold War, including the crisis in Ukraine, could limit any journalist's ability to fund their work. Can you imagine if this was the norm, if this was the norm in Russia, China, or Iran? Our media would be screaming about free speech and First Amendment rights. Yet when we do it, it's okay because it's under the guise of fighting Russian propaganda. We're living in an intellectual no-fly zone where online censorship of dissenting journalism has become the new norm. The U.S. sanctions regime that is trying to starve Russia, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Cuba, and Iran, and over 25% of the world's population, is now targeting its own citizens with its maximum pressure campaign. So we are forced to toe the official government line in order to survive as a journalist in alternative media today. There's a couple larger things that we could say about what happened to you, but let's just begin by saying that there are these organizations like the Daily Beast that have published article after article boosting the war, like this example, "Arming Ukraine is the path to peace," where it actually says that we do not have to choose between supporting Ukraine and World War III, and makes this argument for sending more and more billions of dollars worth of weapons to a country that, by the way, has charted in the top three, if not been one of the number one worst culprits for arms trafficking in the globe. And you're not just getting that from me. That's something that Responsible Statecraft, the Quincy Institute, has highlighted in their work. And they published this over the last few days. At the same time that we've seen the censorship, I think we have to point out that it's paired with this journalism that is now committed to unearthing the quote unquote networks behind journalists, as if we are like shady people who could not do what we are doing without being funded by people in Russia or any of these other countries that are considered adversaries of the United States. So they published this at the Daily Beast, and they went around and they called people, and some of you may recognize the from the graphic. These are people who you've seen in left media. You've seen Ben Norton, Lee Camp. There's Danny Haifong. Max Blumenthal, I believe that's Kim Iverson. They're trying to get Kim Iverson kicked off of The Rising that The Hill does with Ryan Grimm. It's a daily morning show.
Oh, it's not Kim Iverson.
Oh, who is that then, Rania?
She works for CGTN, but she also has her own YouTube channel. I don't remember what her name is, but she's pretty. She has a huge social media following, and they call her. They're like, oh, she's Chinese propaganda.
Okay, well, let me take that back. I apologize for overspeaking, but Kim is under attack, and I don't know what position she's taken on Ukraine. But in any case, just to say that there's a lot happening right now with individuals in alternative media. And there is this genre of journalism now from people who, I don't think they can even claim to be journalists. They're going after people and trying to connect them back to any seedy organization, any sleazy organization they can come up with. Another thing is that Manar's page for Wikipedia was heavily edited in the last 24 hours. I don't know what's happening with your Wikipedia page right now, Joe. I don't know if it's even a particular concern to you, but they're trying to write it into history that we are things that we are not.
Well, it's not a concern to me, Wikipedia, because we don't have a Wikipedia page.
Okay.
There's one for Robert Perry, but nothing else. I don't know how those things come about, but maybe it's better that we don't have one. I think one thing you just said was interesting about they're taking away agency and our ability to make our own minds up, our own decisions based on fact. That it has to be. If we don't go with the approved narrative, then therefore somebody's pulling our strings and making us say this. And this is the thing that bothers me actually the most. Absolutely the most. Because you could disagree with us and try to refute what that's with facts. That's great. That's what this is all about. But you can't say that because I came or we came to these regions because of a paycheck, and we're just absolutely just mouthing, what is we're being told to say, and we cannot make our own minds up and decision. I find that such the biggest insult of all of this. Now, there are readers who depend and viewers who depend on you, Kevin, and you, Rania, and Chris Hedges, and all the rest of them who really, and I'm seeing this, by the way, in the outpouring we're getting on Twitter, in our emails, and in donations since this was announced. So there are people who were upset that this has happened to Consortium News. Now, we're not going down yet. We have other ways of getting funded, but it's such an outrage to think that we are all just these. That Daily Beast piece was just absolutely horrendous. I mean, I didn't want to read. I find it hard to read stuff like that, but I did. It's pure attack journalism. Pure attack journalism. That's what we're being subject to. It is coordinated. It's all going. Anybody who raises their head above the water now to not get with the program of Ukraine as the most important war that has ever fought in human history, and that you cannot in any way say, well, wait a minute, if something. What about all the political parties that Zelensky has shut down, and the fact that he's made every TV station into one, and that the Communist Party was immediately shut down after the coup? Is this a democratic society? What about these far-right neo-Nazi militias? How strong are they? Can't talk about it. Cannot talk about it. And that's not the kind of, United States or Western world that a lot of us want to live in. It just isn't. But that's where we're living right now. And I always imagined, McCarthyism, despite my evident age, was before I was born. And I always imagined what it might be like to live under that. And I think I know now.
Yeah, it is pretty suffocating, the sort of ideological conformity that we see, and the kind of like, oh, there's like a little Putin apologist in every little nook and cranny of the internet that needs to be snuffed out reputationally, and it's pretty outrageous. And then you have on top of that the labeling of outlets as Russia state affiliated media, and the labeling of people, not just outlets. And all of this together, I mean, all of these attacks are meant to set an example, right? Like, it's meant to set an example. Don't do what these people are doing, and don't say what these people are saying, or you could be next. Don't say what Consortium News is saying, because then maybe your outlet will be targeted and will make it impossible for you to raise funds. I mean, because people's livelihoods depend on that. Don't say what these people are saying, or maybe you're going to get labeled state affiliated media, or you're going to be shadow banned, and on and on and on and on. And all of it, of course, is meant to be to make it impossible for people to make a livelihood. That's how, people think of other countries being dictatorial or totalitarian or whatever. They think of it as, putting people in jail for having political opinions that go against the grain, or punishing people through the criminal justice system to try to get them into line. And while that does happen, of course, look what we're doing to Julian Assange, for the most part in the US, it's actually much more, I think, effective, because people are punished. They're not placed in jail, but they're erased, and they're silenced, and their reputations are destroyed, and their ability to have any sort of livelihood is ruined, which is, I mean, essentially starving somebody in the kind of capitalist system we live in. But all while maintaining this illusion of, we love free speech. And yeah, you can go on any street corner and scream whatever you want. You can shout at politicians and say whatever you want. You won't be arrested or jailed, but you also won't be able to make a living.
You mentioned the biggest example of all, Julian Assange, a government that's capable of doing this to Assange, to destroying a man's life, probably his freedom for the rest of that life, is capable of doing small potato stuff like what just happened to Consortium News. We have to keep that in mind. So they hold him up as the major example, and he is the emblem of this age of censorship, this age of repression, because he did such a tremendous job of uncovering so many of their crimes and corruption, and not just the U.S. government, so many governments, that they could not let him get away with it. And they have to not only make him an example, but punish him and stop him from doing more and stop anybody else from doing that. So that is the template. That is the symbol of this whole thing we're talking about. The Julian Assange case, it's in the context of that we have to see everything that's going on right now, because they're telling of a story of the Ukraine war, which is clearly a proxy war being fought by the United States for little regard for the lives of Ukrainians to weaken Russia. They're coming out and saying it now, as Lord Austin, the defense secretary, said the other day. They want to weaken Russia. I believe that they were set a trap for the Russians by drumming up this offensive in Donbass, and the Russians had to decide whether to intervene. That would be the invasion that they were crying about for weeks, if you recall. And then they could start the information war, and most importantly, the economic war. That's an unprecedented economic war that's having a boomerang effect on the West. It may have worse effect on the Western population, especially in Europe, than the Russians. But this was the strategy. And if Putin didn't invade, they couldn't do any of this. And Biden gave it away when he was asked, not only when he said in Poland that it's regime change, but he even said on February 24th, the day of the invasion, that he was asked why we're going to new sanctions when the sanctions already in place didn't stop the invasion. He said those sanctions weren't about stopping the invasion. It's about punishing Putin. So punishing Russia so the Russian people know what he's done to them. That's what this is all about. Those are the exact words. Clearly, the sanctions to try to get an uprising, and then he blurted it out in Poland. So this is the game that's being played. Now, anybody that comes along and questions that, as we have done, as I'm sure Minpress has done, and others, are subject to some kind of penalties. And the first one that came our way is PayPal. And there's another one coming the other way pretty soon. So we are not being punished like Assange because we didn't uncover what he did, but that opened the door to punishing anyone who disturbs the story they're trying to tell everybody, and they successfully make a vast majority of the population to believe. So we're inconvenient to them to even open up some doubts.
And it's worth mentioning that, in fact, there was this blockade against WikiLeaks when it came to PayPal and when it came to being able to use, I believe, cloud services from Amazon. Senator Joe Lieberman, when he was still an actual figure who was somebody in politics who had influence, he went around and was encouraging these companies to not do business with WikiLeaks and offer their services. I know that Stella, who's Julian's wife, was mentioning what was happening to alternative media in the last week and saying, like, the first blueprint for this was really created around how they would handle WikiLeaks. And that is the way it is being applied to Consortium News, the way it's being applied to Mint Press News, these other outlets. And I'd say that along with that is the journalism, that constant attack journalism is what you called it, but there's a whisper campaign where people start gossiping among each other. And if you look at the coverage of WikiLeaks, they start passing around different ideas and thoughts, and they're trying to plant some kind of, well, I know that Matt Taibbi has called it the ick factor. They're trying to create a feeling in the minds of you. But there's other ways to look at it as well. But they want to associate you with something that is going to make it harder for you to effectively spread your journalism. And then once they get that thing, which they succeeded in doing with WikiLeaks, once they do that, then not only are you cut off from your funding sources, but it's really hard to get people to trust you and rely on you as the outlet anymore. So while they're trying to make it impossible for you to fund your organization, they also are trying to kneecap you and make it impossible for you to effectively communicate and spread your journalism.
Sure. We have a very loyal readership and viewership. I don't think they're going to make a dent in them. It could hurt further development of this. Look, this is the fulfillment of Woodrow Wilson's dream. He tried to get in the Espionage Act in 1917, actual government censorship. He lost by one vote in the Senate committee. Then he came up with the Sedition Act that was only the last few years, but he put people in jail for speech. So, but now we move fast forward 100 years, more than 100 years now, and this is what we're getting, especially with with the Ministry of Truth / Disinformation Governance Board, a government agency or part of a government agency, a department that's going to go out there and actually perform censorship. The C word that I very rarely used before because I think it was overused. I'm not reluctant to use that word anymore. That is what's happening. And one reason I think they are so much in overdrive, because unlike Woodrow Wilson's, they're all the way up until the early 2000s, there was only radio, TV, and the newspapers, and individuals could read that and speak amongst their friends, but they didn't have a platform like social media gives. Everyone is a potential mini propagandist. Everyone is a potential journalist who can challenge the government narrative. It's something they have to control that they never saw before. It's a whole different environment. When you have a few three major networks, as they were in the 60s and 70s until cable news, when you've got even now 6 major corporations determining more or less the policy of the corporate media, that's why they all sound so much alike, that's easy to control. But when you've got an potentially out of control internet, where anyone could start up their own webcast, anyone could start a publication, anyone could get thousands, 100,000s of followers on Twitter. By the way, there's a new website a new Twitter page called Ministry of Truth. It started 3 days ago. It has 150,000 followers in 3 days. A parody mock site of Mary Poppins' Job. So this is a different environment where they've got to amp up different ways to control many more little fires that are breaking out because people could think for themselves. And that's what they don't want, obviously. And they have a way to now not only think for themselves, but to speak to large numbers, potentially large numbers of followers and people on social media. So they're scrambling. And that's where we're seeing Wilson's dream being fulfilled now. They don't give a damn anymore the way it looks. They got to. From their point of view, they got to stop this free speech because it's going to undermine their whole program.
Mm-hmm. All right, Joe. Well, it's been really good to talk with you, and we want everyone to support Consortium News. It's at consortiumnews.com, right? Consortiumnews.com, right, Joe?
That's correct. Or I say consortiumnews.com.
I always say consortium. I've been told like 1,000 times consortium, but I can't help myself.
No. Yeah, both are correct, apparently. I wish only one were correct, but I have to accept the contortion of consortium. Anyway, consortium or consortium news. That's it. .com. All
right, but we'll keep in touch with you. By the way, I spoke to you earlier. It seems like everything has moved so fast. I mean, when we last talked, we were discussing how John Kiriakou and Sputnik had been basically banned and taken off of YouTube and things of that nature. We were talking about Lee Camp and Abby Martin. But now it really is reaching us. It's reaching what we do. It's affecting us. And we talked about PayPal, but people have mentioned Patreon shutting people down and removing them. And that's a way that people do fundraising. On our way out here, I'll just mention that Mint Press News wasn't only impacted when it came to PayPal, but a GoFundMe campaign was shut down entirely so that they couldn't do fundraising that way. No explanation. There's no due process. I know in your article you mentioned that there are people non-political, a famous poker player who was going to sue PayPal is part of a class action lawsuit because they just seized money without even giving that person any explanation. So it does look like the people who aren't political have gone through this before, but the issue is now with the climate that we're in, the ideas that we have, that perhaps we don't have as much power to point out the due process violations as they do, because they're not doing anything that's a threat to the government. We are. So, PayPal might be willing to correct their missteps with them, but as for us, who knows?
Yeah, it's really happening, what we all feared.
All right. Well, it's good to see you, Rania. It's good to talk to you, Joe. It's good to talk to everyone. And we'll be back soon with another episode of Unauthorized Disclosure.
Very good. Thank you. Bye-bye.